All right. Today is our first day to talk about cells. And given that it's our first day to talk about cells, we're going to talk about the following things: different types of cells, where cells came from, how they developed, and this concept called compartmentalization, or why eukaryotic cells have these smaller structures within inside of them called organelles. So, first things first, why are we even going to talk about cells? Well, cells are the basic building blocks of our bodies and of life. So they're the smallest indivisible unit of living things that we can still say are alive. So individual cells are alive. And if we group cells together that all have the same function, we create things called tissues. And tissues come together to make organs, and organs are grouped together to form bodies. So cells do all the work of life. Cells have many different jobs to keep organisms alive. They need to exchange gases. So, like in our bodies, they are responsible for taking in oxygen when we breathe in and removing CO2 when we breathe out. They need to be able to take in and digest nutrients. So they need to be able to break down those macromolecules we talked about last unit and use them for energy and to make that into energy that the cell can use. And so in a two units, we're going to talk about how that's done, how we make ATP from macromolecules. But we need to know for now that cells need to make energy from the food that they take in. They're going to also use those substances that they take in to make other macromolecules from scratch that they need, so proteins, carbs, fats, and nucleic acids, to remove wastes, byproducts that are not good for the cell, to maintain homeostasis and respond to changes in their external environments, and also to make more cells when they need to grow, repair damage, and reproduce. So cells need to be able to do all these things. If we would group all those things into three main groups or main jobs, we would say that cells need to make energy, they need to make proteins, and they need to be able to make more cells. So all of these different functions on this page can be grouped into three purposes: making energy, making proteins, and making more cells. And really, the remainder of the first semester of our class are going to be talking about in detail how cells do these three things. So, we have a whole unit on how cells do this, make energy. In genetics, we really talk about this, how cells make proteins, because that is the end product of most of our genes. And our next unit, after this unit right now, we're going to be talking about how cells make more cells and the cell cycle and how they communicate with one another. So really the rest, if you think about the rest of first semester, is talking about mainly 80 to 90% of it is these three things. All life on Earth is made of cells, and we can break down cells into two smaller groups. So all cells are either eukaryotic, and main examples of eukaryotic cells are animal cells and plant cells, and prokaryotic. The main example of a prokaryote is bacteria cells. So bacteria cells are probably the most common, um, at least in the average person's experience, type of prokaryotic cells that they're familiar with. And eukaryotic cells make up us and other animals and plants and fungi and things like that. So we're going to need to know the similarities and differences between these types of cells. So everything, all life is made up of cells, and there are two main groups of cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. So firstly, prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells are very different sizes. So most bacteria, and all bacteria are prokaryotic cells, are about 1 to 10 microns big. Now there are some exceptions, but we're talking about most. Now similarly, most eukaryotic cells, and there are some exceptions, are 10 to 100 microns big. Now if we look down here, a micron is 1/1 millionth of a meter. Or in other words, a human hair is about 20 microns. So even amongst the largest, on average, bacteria, they're about half the size of a human hair. Okay. Here is a little artistic representation that try to shows you just comparison wise the difference between the average bacteria cell or prokaryotic cell and the average eukaryotic cell in size. So let's get a little bit more into the similarities and differences. Prokaryotic cells were the first type of cell to evolve, the first type of cell on Earth, and they came to be about 3.5 billion years ago. That's 3,500 million years. It's pretty crazy. Like we said, they're usually smaller, and they're in organisms like bacteria and archaea. Now, all prokaryotic cells are unicellular, which means every single prokaryotic organism is only one cell big. There are no, as far as we know of them, multicellular prokaryotes. There are no multicellular prokaryotes, and we'll talk a little bit about probably why that is when we talk about compartmentalization. All prokaryotes reproduce asexually, so they basically make clones of themselves. And they have very important no membrane bound organelles. So they don't have things like a nucleus. They don't have things like uh, the mitochondria. They don't have things like Golgi bodies. All of those same functions are achieved through enzymes that are dissolved in the cytoplasm, just inside the cell. They do, though, contain ribosomes, a cell membrane, cell wall. So prokaryotes all have a cell wall, cytoplasm, and sometimes flagella, which is this whip-like tail structure you see in this picture that I included. They also have genetic information and DNA, but it's contained in like a diffuse stringy structure called a nucleoid, which is a false nucleus. And they also have circular segments of DNA in the cytoplasm called plasmids, and those are going to become really important when we talk about um, genetic engineering and recombinant DNA when we look at um, biotechnology at the beginning of second semester. Here are pictures are what are called stromatolites, which are big fossilized microbial mats. And this is where we find evidence of the earliest prokaryotic cells in these big hulking piles of fossilized microbia from almost 3.5 billion years ago. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, are only about 2.5 billion years old. So it took 1 billion years from the first prokaryotes, that at least we have evidence of, to the first eukaryotes. They're larger. They're found in animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And the cool thing is eukaryotes can also be unicellular, so only one cell big, but eukaryotes can also be multicellular, so organisms composed of multiple cells. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. And really important, they have membrane-bound organelles, so like mitochondria, a nucleus, chloroplasts, vacuoles, all of those things. And DNA in eukaryotic cells are packaged into linear structures called chromosomes that are contained in the nucleus. Eukaryote, the word itself means true nucleus. So that's one of the main defining features that the scientists who first made distinguished prokaryotes and eukaryotes was that one had a nucleus and the other didn't. Here's a fossil of some of the oldest known eukaryotes, which is a predecessor, a ancestor to algae in this piece of rock. It's about 2.5 billion years old. So one of the questions we started with was, why do eukaryotes have organelles and why would they evolve? What's the use? What's so good about having organelles? And having organelles is what we call compartmentalization, or we break up the inside of this cell, this compartment, into smaller pieces, smaller compartments. And that allows to have specialized structures, which, like the different organelles, and each of those different organelles have specialized functions. So we're able to take all the different things that the cell needs to do and create different structures that really specialize in doing them really efficiently. So we can partition or break up the inside of the cell into different compartments, and those different compartments can have their own internal environment. So different pHs, different concentrations of materials, which allows each of those organelles to have distinct and specialized functions. And what all that means is that these cells can be more efficient in doing their jobs because they have structures that specialize in doing only certain things. Okay? So the real advantage is that eukaryotic cells can become specialized to do specific functions. And that's what allows eukaryotic organisms to grow so much larger, is because they're able to be much more efficient with the utilization and transport of material due to this compartmentalization. Now, how did eukaryotic cells come to be? How did they evolve? This is a question that has been plaguing scientists, that scientists have researched for a long time. And in the early 1980s, the most or I should say the theory that is now amongst cellular biologists the most agreed upon came about. It's called the endosymbiotic theory. And this theory basically states that the organelles within eukaryotic organisms were once individually free-living prokaryotic cells. So, like mitochondria and chloroplasts were each in the past their own specialized free-living prokaryotes that then got engulfed by a larger ancestral prokaryote. So, endosymbiosis, like endo meaning inside, symbiosis means to live with, is the theory that cells live within one another as a partnership and that there's an evolutionary advantage for both. So, for example, if we go back in our mind to before eukaryotes, right at the precipice of eukaryotes really developing, there were larger prokaryotic cells and there were smaller ones. Now, larger cells could have an advantage competing for resources like food and resources than smaller ones. But some of the smaller prokaryotic cells had ended up specializing to make use of energy in different ways. So prokaryotic cells, early prokaryotic cells, at some point evolved and developed the ability to harness sunlight energy to make organic molecules. So the first very rudimentary photosynthetic pathways. And similarly, other groups of cells first developed or evolved rudiments to utilize energy stored in macromolecules to turn into ATP, or the first cellular respiration pathways. Now, larger cells were able to gather these resources, and the smaller specialized cells were able to turn them into macromolecules and into energy. And so this symbiotic relationship, the larger organism protects and gathers the resources, and the smaller cells utilize them and produce these needed products. There's a mutually beneficial relationship, and that's what this theory says developed. So, here in this picture, structures of modern cells provide evidence in support of this theory. So, chloroplasts and mitochondria both share characteristics with prokaryotes even today. So, for example, mitochondria and chloroplasts both have double membranes, just like cells have a bilayer double membrane. Believe it or not, mitochondria and chloroplasts can both replicate on their own via binary fission. So they can both self-replicate. They both also contain their own small ribosomes inside of them that are very similar to prokaryotic ribosomes. They're actually more similar to prokaryotic ribosomes than they are to eukaryotic ribosomes. And believe it or not, mitochondria and chloroplasts also have their own small circular strands of DNA, just like bacteria. So these are some of the pieces of evidence that we use that supports the theory of endosymbiosis. So here might be a simple timeline of what the endosymbiotic theory suggests could have given rise to the first eukaryotic cells. So we start back in time with an ancestral prokaryote that just has cytoplasm, DNA, ribosomes, and a plasma membrane. Some infoldings of the plasma membrane developed the first endoplasmic reticula and the nucleus. These same larger prokaryotes engulfed earlier, smaller prokaryotes that were able to respirate and photosynthesize. And that mutually beneficial relationship became so strong that eventually the two cells depended on each other so much you couldn't separate them. One couldn't survive without the other, and they became permanently fused together in the first ancestral photosynthetic eukaryotic cells. Now, of course, this was a very slow, it took over 1 billion years, 100 million years, or sorry, 1,000 million years for this to happen. So it wasn't overnight by any means, but eventually it gave rise to the first eukaryotic cells. Here's another picture, just example of what that might have looked like, artistic representation over a 1,000 million years. All right. So from today, we need to be able to compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, what structures and functions and characteristics they have in common and unique. We need to explain compartmentalization and how compartmentalization gave rise to the utility of eukaryotic cells. And we need to be able to describe the endosymbiotic theory and discuss how evidence uh, exists that support the endosymbiotic theory as the evolutionary mechanism by which eukaryotic cells developed.